Oli, welcome to Camber Conversations, optimised by Pure Sport. Are we ready to rumble?
We're ready to rumble. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to sit down with you. And when I was going back into the archives to understand who is Oli Patrick, what's he been up to, I really feel that we're speaking at a time where you're bursting through the surface and becoming more known, because you've been building expertise for years and years and years. But now everywhere I look online, your content's sort of being more visible for the last couple of years, probably.
Yeah, and sort of, it's a worrying explosion, but it's not happened overnight, you know. And I suppose in the weird world of well-being and physiology, I think you have to sort of know what you're talking about before you speak more broadly. And anyone, I think, who's good should have some degree of imposter syndrome, that you worry, am I good enough to share that opinion? Have I got, you know, am I giving this the right level of due diligence? And I think I held back on speaking for many, many years until I felt I'd learned something worth speaking about.
One of the things that I think plagues modern society is fake gurus.
Yes.
So it's nice when you have somebody that's got the credentials, but equally my bias on the podcast has been speaking to people who, yes, have the credentials, but have applied them as well.
Yeah.
I rail against intellectual masturbation.
Okay, excellent.
I'm a big fan of doing the real thing.
Yeah.
So somebody that can cite studies, but what does that mean in reality for Joe Blogs? Or actually, in reality, we're not talking to Joe Blogs. We're talking to people who are listening to a self-development podcast every single week. So they're looking to strive to be their best. So what's applicable that maybe a control group have gone through versus what can I do in my day-to-day life to try and excel?
Yeah, I think the great challenge is what do we mean by expertise? Because there are these different camps, and someone who can do a good critical analysis of the research papers is great, right? We need critical analysis of what we know and what we don't know. But that's very different to being a practitioner. And what we find in the world of gurus, most of them don't know that they're a false guru, because we all have bias, right? Your lived experience. And if you manage to, you know, correct your chronic fatigue through taking a particular supplement, you would be, you know, fully within your rights to go online and say, bloody hell, everyone needs more of this particular nutrient, and you'll get over your fatigue because you have that lived experience that you feel is very powerful. The flip of that is you've got people who sit and saying, well, unless there's a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, or, you know, or a randomized controlled trial, I won't accept that data. Then on the other side, you've got practitioners who say every person whose back I click can walk, you know, a marathon pain-free. And we've got this weird sort of swirling noise of lived experience, of practitioner-led experience, of data-driven, you know, advice, and most of those things are conflicting. So there's never been a greater need for well-being advice, and there's never been a greater disparity in the sources and quality of that well-being advice. So I sort of try and sit relatively agnostic, with a bit of empathy, with some, you know, with the ability to understand and interpret what I believe is the evidence-based data, but with 25 years of clinical experience that I can pull on to frame everything that I talk about.
Yeah, and part of your experience that I was learning about was running these almost MOTs that you were describing as like a health screening or a health assessment.
Yeah.
And the amount of data that those provide you with, really shaping how somebody might make some lifestyle interventions proactively rather than reactively.
Yes.
Which, again, the type of people that listen to a podcast like this one, that listen to your new show, the Energy Equation, they want to be proactive. They want to take the bull by the horns. They want to take on things before they become an issue.
100%. I think what's interesting about the world of health assessments, health screening, and, you know, health MOT is what does it mean to be healthy? And what you've got is that is the starting point of that conversation. And I think broadly within the many years of doing health assessments, you could break people into two camps. One was, I have unexplained health challenges and I want data to corroborate what I'm feeling. And fatigue is always a great one for that, right? If you meet someone with a chronic fatigue disorder, they need a name to it, because without a name, there's no treatment pathway. And without a name, there's that question, are you just making this up? Right? And they get sent to psychological therapy after years of not being able to get out of bed. Someone saying, look, you're just weak in the mind. And they're like, no, I'm telling you, I have a physiological disorder. So when you do health assessments, you often get people who've been failed by the traditional medical system to put a name to the aggregation of their symptoms. So they're tired, they've got crap sex drive, their skin's, you know, going wild and wacky, but it's not a definable psoriasis or an eczema. And they want data to endorse the way they feel, but more importantly, give them a route out of that feeling. Then you've got probably our natural group, the sort of the preventative, the biohacker, the longevity, who are saying, look, I want to squeeze this machine for all I've got, and I need to know, how do I hyper-personalize my dosages of lifestyle? Because I can look at the government guidelines and go 150 minutes of exercise, 2 weight training sessions, two
50 grams of protein. You're
50 grams of
thinking,
protein.
bro, you're not getting anything on that.
Exactly right. So, that minimum dose to not be dysfunctional doesn't apply to me. And those people have recognized that the government guidelines are about avoiding dysfunction, not optimizing function. So they want then that individual data to curate the best lifestyle strategy imaginable. And probably as I moved up and up the ranks of delivering more and more complicated health assessments, culminating in arguably the world's most advanced and expensive health assessment, we have those two camps: people who are dysfunctional but couldn't work out how to get out of it, people who wanted to optimize, biohack, and wanted to know whether it was a particular dosage of magnesium and whether it was, their protein cycling and whether they should be doing, eccentric plyometric work. They wanted the absolute thing for them, not something that was applicable to a male of 30, of their sort of, ethnicity. They wanted their dose.
It's good, isn't it? I think those two camps are very different demographics, but both are seeking an answer and information and data. And
Yes.
I've thought about this quite a lot. Sometimes I feel like we're trying to drink from a fire hose when it comes to the information that's available to us.
Yes.
And that's not a pleasant situation for anyone that can visualize that. It's listening to the car stereo or the AirPods just now thinking that sounds unpleasant.
That's a great
That's what it's like
Yeah.
online sometimes,
Yeah.
because I think you've got the longevity, for example, you've got the likes of a Brian Johnson.
Yep.
I hosted a guy called Chris Marable last year who reduced his aging by 33%, and it was nowhere near as extreme as what Brian does, and he's not a multimillionaire.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when you have that sort of information, it's very hard to apply that to your day-to-day life when you're either building a business, you're working in a high-flying 9 to 5, or you're a family man, or whatever your different plates that you're spinning are.
Yes.
It's really, really challenging. And I think the focus has got to be for content like I produce, content like you produce, is that people have things that they can make changes that are the 1%ers that I hear you speak about, rather than the completely transformative stuff that means that you live in an airtight bubble and you only get exposed to this amount of UV and you wear this SPF and you sleep this number of hours a day and you take, I don't know how many pills he consumes at this stage.
Yeah. Oh, he's at 155 and counting,
Wild.
daily. And I think that is one of the great challenges. People start with the solution. They don't start with the problem. And someone would say, what's the best thing you could do for longevity? And I'll be like, well, what's the thing you're not doing? Right? Because if you don't sleep's your best thing for longevity. If you over consume, an abundance of the wrong type of calories, then restricting calories, fasting's the best thing. If you have low muscle mass, then resistance training. If you have low aerobic capacity, then cardiorespiratory training. So what we often get is people are often drawn to the thing that they find easiest to apply to their life. And I think that's crucial, because you only ever rent well-being, you only ever rent fitness. So anything you do for 3 weeks, you've got to see yourself doing for the next 3, 6, 10, 12 years. So we've got to pick the right thing that's a sustainable, could become a habit and habitual, embedded into my life. But if we start with the product, we'll often choose the thing that we can most easily see fitting into my life, not necessarily the thing that is my limiting factor. And what I'm really trying to get out there in the world of well-being is context. Don't start with the product, start with the problem, and then go to the best product to solve that problem. And when someone says, I'm going to go into, I'm going to do compression trousers, I'm a big believer in compression trousers. But what if, excessive inflammation from excessive training wasn't the reason you were tired? Therefore, you're potentially misdirecting yourself, rather than going back to the reason you're tired and then finding a solution from there.
These days, it feels like every brand is shouting about how supplements are the answer to everything and all your problems. Before you jump on the latest wellness trend, it's worth remembering the foundations and basics come first. Hydration, good nutrition, rest, movement are the real keys. When you do decide to supplement, however, what you choose really does matter. I'm a big fan of removing toxins and unnecessary things from your lifestyle, and I ensure that my supplements are free from additives, artificial flavors, and any unnecessary, dirty, toxic fillers. Personally, having seen many professional athletes and top performers utilize their products, I decided to give Pure Sport supplements a go. Their products are built on science-backed information, minimal ingredients, and they do exactly what they're meant to. Whether it's their best-selling ultra electrolytes to keep you hydrated and energized, their deep magnesium to support with quality sleep, or even their natural testosterone-boosting Tonka Ali, I trust that what they make is developed to care for me and my body. Explore the full range of Pure Sport supplements at the link in the show notes, puresport.co, and use the code CAMBRO10 for 10% off.
Because some of these solutions can be sexy and appealing because of how they've been marketed, both online and by the companies that sell them, as is their right to do. We live in a capitalist society, thankfully.
Yeah.
And if you're drawn to those potentially quick fixes or fixes that would be relevant to somebody else,
Yeah.
then you're missing the wood for the trees, or the forest for the trees sometimes, because it could be something that's more fundamental.
Yeah.
And one of the big topics I want to get into with is, of course, your podcast, The Energy Equation. The term energy is something that everyone listening to this will maybe have like a different feeling or reaction towards. They'll think like, oh, I'm a high energy person. And if you listen to me when I'm caffeinated on the podcast, you think I'm very high energy. Or if you watch me in a sales pitch, I'm very high energy.
Yeah.
But energy fluctuates massively. And I wonder if we were to get into that, how would you define energy in general terms?
Yeah, I think any definition I give it in general terms will meet some people's expectation but fail others. So I define energy in the sense of how other people frame it. I think we have to go back and say, look, there are 4 real domains of which I will express my energy. The first is my physical energy. So if I take, and we do this on the energy equation, we ask people to rate their energy 0 to 100. And that's the only score I'm really interested in, because your perception of your energy is all I'm working with. I'm not going to tell someone who's got an energy score of 95 that they need to do other things. I'll be like, oh my God, how do I get a 95? So start with the idea of physical energy would be my ability to complete all the tasks that I would want to complete. And, that's, I've got the energy to exercise, I've got the energy to prep my meals, I've got the energy to get out of bed without hypercaffeinating, I've got the energy to get myself into bed when I've got that early stages of fatigue. I sort of don't feel rate limited in my physicality. And a good expression of that would also be immunity. Your immune system and your physical energy are so
how susceptible we are to disease or little bugs here and there.
Exactly right. And the same immune system that resists the bug or gets you over the 2-day cold versus the 5-day cold is the same immune system that's mopping up early cancer cells, preparing blood vessel walls for cardiovascular disease. So
it's a great indicator.
Great indicator. And your immune system is a very early barometer of inadequate energy. And most people will get that, right? But and we can look at that in really sort of clinical terms by discussing herpes, which is always a fun topic to get into. But herpes simplex, is the traditional virus people get if they're lucky enough to snog someone, or you can get it through not kissing, but I think that's much less fun. You can get it off a toilet seat, whatever you're doing. You can get it loads of different ways, but when you get it, you've got it, right? So herpes simplex sits in the cells of your body as a chronic viral infection, and it is held within the cells by the quality of your immune system. When your immune system's not there, it manifests as a cold sore, right? So you get lots of people going, oh, I get a cold sore when I'm run down. Like, well, what do you mean by run down? They're like, well, excessive stress, lack of exercise, lack of diet, lack of sleep. And what you've got there is all the mechanisms that preserved your physical energy have depreciated, and your body then can no longer hold that herpes simplex in the cell. You get a cold sore, and that's an incredible early warning sign that you should respond to, not by covering it in Zovirex and managing the symptom, but by addressing the behaviors that let your immune system slip. So physical energy will be everything from, can I train, can I cook, is my immune system robust? But that's not the only source of energy. Your ability to think strategically, your cognitive clarity, your
to be verbose, to be articulate, to be able to recall things as well.
100%. So your people will know when they've got that sort of brain fog that has a time with physical energy, but also when we're under the cosh, it's not a great time to make a big decision. We say don't divorce your spouse when you're tired. Don't decide to leave a job that you did once love that you now don't seem to love because you're exhausted. But cognitive energy really is my mental growth, my clarity of thinking, more strategic versus reactive. And that's, again, another thing I could scale 0 to 100. I could also scale my emotional energy and say, am I able to harbor difficult relationships, not just good ones? And good ones are great, but if I surround myself with just good ones, I end up where I found lots of my clients over the years.
Emotional regulation is such an important skill, but as you say, if our energy level isn't there, we have less bandwidth to handle it.
100%. And so and all of these things you'll see are expressions of energy. They're also sources of energy. So what we get is when you've got low emotional energy, you might not be ringing the parent that you need to ring. You might not be going to the social event that you feel you haven't got the energy to socialize, and we all know that when you do go there, most people fill their cup rather than empty it. And then the fourth domain of energy would be sort of spiritual energy, which aligns to not faith or God, but purpose. So, what's the point in me existing? Why am I here? Do I do any good? Am I contributing? And that contribution could be my own personal growth. It could be, things that don't have great philanthropic meaning, but they mean something to me. And so when we look at does someone have good energy, we can sort of take a snapshot of 0 to 100, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. And if those numbers are lower than the individual wants, then I've got an incentive to improve their energy. If those numbers are where they want them to be, then we just keep doing what you're doing because the formula's working.
Yes, and as long as you can work out what habits are contributing towards that at that moment in time, because sometimes something slips in somebody's routine or changes, and there's like a lag effect
Yes.
of when the challenge kicks in.
Agree.
For example, I'm in London today, travelled from Clapham this morning across to Hackney where we're sat in the studio.
Awesome.
On the Northern Line, incredibly busy.
Yes.
My commute in Glasgow when I'm there or in Dubai when I'm there is radically different.
Yeah.
So when I'm on my way to the studio, I don't have the same level of stress or negative impact on my energy. So when I came off the tube this morning, I was like, right, okay, I've got a 10-minute walk to get to the studio. Let's chat to Hugo, who's accompanied me to the studio, who works on the clips in the podcast. Let's have like a kind of chilled, positive conversation to shift state from the negativity of the tube. And I'm not shitting on the tube. It's a very important resource to get us around, but it's not the kind of place you want to spend a lot of time.
No.
And I can tell you right now that I function on a very high level because I try and have variables in my life that don't bring my energy down like that.
Yes.
And I came off and I was like, right, time to reset.
Yep.
If I was doing that every day, I would struggle with that.
And I think that there's two key parts to that. First is you understand the levers that you can pull, right? So if you understand that you've got this fairly high intensity commute, then you might change a lever down the line. Might go, right, then it's maybe not a day for a super high intensity workout today. So I'll do more of a zone 2 in nature, chill out workout. I'll offset that in the same way as I might have a terrible meal earlier, but I can offset it with a more, nutrient abundant meal later. And I think this is what we really talk about health literacy is there's no singular thing that's good or bad for you universally. There is being able to apply mostly good things. And that requires you to understand what the rules of the game are. And when you know the rules of the game, you realize that then you've got multiple tools to offset things. So you don't have to avoid the tube. You just need to offset the tube. And if that's 1 day out of 7, that's no burden. If you're doing that, 6 days a week for 3 years, and then you're suddenly wondering why your capacity at work's gone down, you didn't know that commute was causing a major part of your progressive burnout. And I think, so there's the first part is this sort of, when you know the rules of the game, it's easier to play. And most people don't know the rules of the game. They don't understand the correlation between behaviors and physiology and feeling. And that's a really important pyramid. My behaviors affect my physiology, and that will manifest as how I feel. Energy being one expression of that.
Awareness is such an important skill.
Yeah.
And I think some people walk around on autopilot far too often.
Yeah.
And that's a big, big risk that we come up against. When it comes to things like me being on that tube this morning and recognizing in my own body that my stress was up, I had key things that I knew that I could do straight away off the back of it that meant that I would get back into the sort of state that I want to be in to do a podcast like this and the 3 others that we've got planned for after this. And having those things, like, again, I've got cheesy phrases like motion is lotion. So I went for I would have happily walked a little bit more before I got to the studio because I was feeling good. I was feeling verbose. Yes. I can have little triggers that I can switch to. So I can put in particular music that I listen to before I public speak, or particular music that I listen to before I podcast, or I could listen to another episode that you've been on so I feel more prepped for it and it relaxes me. Yeah. I sat downstairs in the cafe and I reviewed my notes that I was going to speak to you and then Dan Tem later on. And that gets me back in a state where I'm ready to rumble.
Yep.
And I hope more people can find those offset habits that get us back to where we want to be.
I totally agree. I think we've got to start with the idea that we're not trying to avoid these situations in many cases. You're trying to manage your pressures this morning because you have an abundance of pressures through the day. So you're saying, look, I already got a pretty big, we would call that sort of phrase load, which would tie into technologies that are measuring this, things like Whoop and things like Aura would describe this as load. But you've got a lot of inputs today. So one extra input may alter your performance through your capability through podcasts. So then you're in that position of saying, okay, I recognize that. So I've got some real-time tools that I can use to offset some of that load. One of which would be low intensity cardio. If that's in nature, that's great. There's some physical elements you can do, which will do that. The most obvious and immediate would be breath work. So breath work is a very robust physiological technique to immediately change my state, and that can change, how I function. You've also got then psychological strategies like saying, okay, I can manage my load in not just by dissipating the impact on my physiology, but by preparing better. And that mental preparation decreases the amount of pressure you'd feel through the podcast you got to do today. Your third area is sort of environment. So when we look at how people manage pressure, I can change the volume of pressures, I can change how many pressures you perceive, and I can change how your body reacts to those pressures. So I've got 3 different layers. And an example there would be, if I change the environment or volume of pressures, I could get an Uber. So if I think the tube is too much, I'll get an Uber. If I think Uber's too much, then I'll record remotely, right? So I can change my world sometimes without having to change my reaction. Point number 2 is what if I view that intense period as an exciting experience? I reframe it and do anything from cognitive behavioral therapy to visualization to other.
Even just swapping the meaning of the words.
Swapping basic changes of the words.
I never get nervous. I only get excited.
Brilliant. The perfect example.
Lady called Hannah Hughesman taught me that on years ago, episode 110, something like that. She was a mental performance coach for the Texas Rangers.
Yeah.
And I loved her LinkedIn. She had like Mindset Monday or something like that was like her series, and I remember messaging her and being like, I'd love to have you on the podcast, and she was like, yeah, we'll jump on. And she was like, my players don't get nervous, they get excited, because it comes from the same part of the body.
Absolutely,
the same hormones are pumping.
It's the same physiology.
Just reframe it. So I love that you straight away said, let's just think about it in a different way.
And that technique is gold. And there comes a point when you can be still too excited. So excitement can also, over time be too much. And that sort of arousal performance curve is a really interesting piece that we can chat about.
If you're new to the podcast, make sure you've hit the subscribe or the follow button on whatever platform you're listening on, so I can keep getting fantastic guests just like this one.
And then the third element is like, right, I couldn't change that. I've got to get on the tube. I am excited, but it's very excited, and I don't want to be too excited all day. So then I'll just down-regulate the physiology of this by breath work, by managing caffeine, by using what we call biophilia, so the body's natural calming response when it finds itself in nature, through low-intensity, steady-state, cardio, which has an incredible role at reducing stress, not increasing stress, through ringing in a person who always lifts you up. You've got these energy givers, you've got these energy takers, and we need both in our life, truth be told. But there's a load of stuff you can do that says that the tube has to exist. I'm going to be excited, but I don't want to be too excited, so I'll buffer it. And that's really what lots of the physiological techniques are doing.
The key term that comes back to me when I hear information like that is empowerment.
Yeah.
It's empowering people to deal with the different things that we come up against in life.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you bring up the spiritual element, because Tim Cook has a quote: the tools will be heavy, but they'll feel light in your hands.
Very good.
So I'm on 4 podcasts today, and I'm going to do a guest one in the afternoon.
I mean, it's big. It's a big day.
But I feel energized doing it, Ollie.
Yeah.
I feel up for it.
Yeah.
In the same way, I've been doing sales coaching the last 6-7 months, one-to-ones or with businesses.
Yeah.
And I come out those days, even if it's like 4 hours where I've spoken a lot, I come out and I'm like, I feel really good after that, because there's like a positive feedback loop from it.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about things that I care about that come easily to me. Like every guest I get to speak to today, I'm excited to speak to. And that fuels me.
Yes.
Whereas if you were like, Colin, you're going to do 4 hours back to back of filling out the CRM for your sales coaching, for your sales prospecting clients, you're going to be filling in this admin and this admin.
Yeah.
I would be like, okay, I can do about 30 minutes and then I'm going to take a break.
Yeah.
Because it exhausts me.
Yeah.
So recognizing what fuels you as well, because potentially tiring activities can also give you energy.
Spot on. Well, and in that we recognize that those tiring activities, that pressure, that stress is the elixir of energy, right? And there's been this sort of really odd rebuttal of stress as a negative thing, where we've got to recognize it's a hugely positive thing. We are not seeking a life that avoids stimulus. We're not seeking a life that avoids pressure. We grow through doing things we can't quite do, and that can't quite do feels uncomfortable. That is a heavy day, but you tomorrow will be enriched by a crazy day today. Now the challenge is if tomorrow looks like today and the day after looks like today, and what we have to reconcile is bursts of excessive pressure must be met with an abundance of recovery, restoration, and room for that growth. But we I think there's been a real challenge that if I look at my corporate well-being work, lots of the big organizations are struggling with the new framing of stress and mental health by Gen Z, and these employees feeling very sensitive to the negative sensation of hyper stress. And that's because they're being told it's bad. And these organizations say, no, that is where you are forged in the fires. This is going to make you the manager.
It's the growth zone.
It's the growth zone.
Again, it's so easy to bring it back to weight training, because many of the guys that listen to this will be in the gym training, but you don't grow muscle by doing the same weight over and over and over again. We have to progressively overload in either intensity, frequency, or volume.
100%.
To stretch that. And
Yes.
I've got an Oli Patrickism: low pressure equals low performance.
Amen.
I wrote that down the other day and I was like, that is so true, because as you're saying there, there's like an element of pressure required to get into the growth zone.
Yes.
If people have this mindset that any form of stress whatsoever is bad for them,
Yes.
then we would never do anything. We would wither and die on the vine. And nobody listening to a podcast like this one wants that.
No, and that's, this audience is looking for growth. And we're all looking for that sweet spot between slightly more than we can handle, but not so much it comes at, a progressive cost. And that's iterative, and that's a lifelong journey, should be.
Do you think there's times where people should try and push those boundaries to find out what they're capable of?
Youth, and I think, we've got to reconcile that physiology has got an incredible elasticity to it up until the age of about 35. So, that old phrase, youth is wasted on the young, has some sense at the moment, but we're saying people are sort of fearing away from pressure and stress and being uncomfortable in a stage of life where you are designed to do it, and most people will, if people imbibe a bit of the booze or substances, your relationship with how well you detoxify those will change overnight, somewhere in your mid-30s, where your hangover is untenable. Your training volume will then become an injury, catastrophe. Your ability to stay up late 2 nights on the weekend means you can no longer work, that Monday, Tuesday. What you've got with youth is an experimental period of time. And by youth, I'm really saying up to the age of 35, you've got the chance to rag the machine without significant risk of long-term disease or it falling over. Now that isn't also a free ticket. You've got to be listening to those early warning signs of depreciating energy. We know overtraining. The first sign is my weights are not going up and my heart rate is higher for the same, per kilometer treadmill speed, whatever I'm running at. But people who should be leaning into stress are those with the capacity to really swallow quite a significant amount, and that is people in their 20s and early 30s.
I think it's your duty to some extent to test the boundaries.
I totally agree.
And I feel a life well lived is one where I find out what my limits and potential is.
Yeah.
Like the whole, again, I do a solo podcast every 10 episodes, and regularly the questions are about potential, what you're capable of, fulfillment, purpose. And many of the times my answer is, I would hate to be, and again, it's such a vivid image, but lying on your deathbed and think back and like, did I push myself with the podcast? Did I push myself with my sales coaching? Did I push myself with my weight training? Did I push myself with my social relationships? Did I ever go and talk to the girl in the coffee shop that I thought was cute? Like, did I actually live life on terms that I can reflect on happily? And it's a silly framework, but it's a framework that people can use.
I love it. A friend of mine, Adrienne Adami, she wrote a book, Decisions That Matter. Really good book about how we make decisions and which ones matter. And really, there's a key part in there that says we rarely regret the decisions we make. We regret the decisions we don't make. And, you've met lots and lots of successful people. I've had the pleasure of working with people who've made extraordinary successes of their lives. They were prepared to fail. And I think that failure can also be a physical failing as much as it is a business failing or a psychological failing. But the failing is the growth. We don't have to listen to another podcast to know every single person would attribute the failures and the defeats as the growth that enabled them to get the successes. If you win everything, you really don't understand yourself, you don't understand the world, and no one wins everything. But you've got to put yourself in that place where you're given the opportunity to fail.
I'm laughing because we have the narrative of all stress is a bad thing for some elements of Gen Z.
Yeah.
But we live in this golden age of podcasts and content where people are telling about how important their failures were to maybe pivot from one thing to the next.
Yeah.
And it's these two juxtapositions
So
that
true.
are both competing.
Yeah.
And it's like, what are you going to choose to listen to? Because they'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Totally.
So listen to one thing, believe one thing, and go with it. And I know what one to believe. It's not that any stress is bad, because we know that stress, as we've discussed, when managed correctly, is helping us to achieve more and more over time.
Yeah, enormously. I think, no one sets out to fail. So I think that the danger of listening to those narratives is I've got to have a business that blows up, and I've got to, train to the point where I get burnout so I can have these lived experiences. It's putting yourself in a position where you may fail is really what we're trying to incentivize. And having the psychological and physical reserves to do that. And that might be you've got to build some basic skills in a standardized workplace for a period of time, or you've got to do a relatively low training volume before you increase it. So not everyone needs to dive into the deep end of the swimming pool with something that's very likely to fail. But I think fear of failure, avoiding risk, avoiding stretch, avoiding being uncomfortable is the message that I would get on board with. Those things should be lent into and learn from in a sort of an overall inflection of just always be kind to yourself. You know, if it doesn't feel right, then maybe it isn't. But just going that little bit further from a physical point of view, from a work point of view, from a personal growth point of view, to chase that boy or that girl that feels a little bit out of your league, that is the joy of life, really. And to avoid that, for me, is such a great shame.
Yeah. I wrote down in advance that stress has 3 real causes that you were talking about online.
Yeah.
Heat, noise, and loads or weight.
Yeah.
What are some of those sources that we can consider?
Yeah, I suppose what I'm saying with there is your physiology is always reacting to the environment it's in. So when people think about stress, if we think about you going onto that tube, the only true stresses there would have been the noise of it and the change in temperature, and that will accelerate the inside of your physiology. Everything else that's happening to your body is what you perceive is happening. So if you go that person's too close to me, or I can smell that person's breath behind me. Everything you perceive then deepens or reduces that stress response. So if I always go one step back, so the physiology we measure on the energy equation, we use heart rate variability, which has sort of become the parameter of the day, and probably hopefully will be the parameter of the century, because heart rate variability is a way of capturing the balance of someone's autonomic nervous system. And in very simple terms, I can look inside someone's physiology and say, are they ready for threat, or are they physiologically ready for restoration and recovery? And humans have sort of got those 2 gears. I can be ready for danger, or I can be ready for calm. And heart rate variability is a clever technology that allows you to gauge that. When we look at the body getting ready for threat, the only things that will guarantee that is if I heat this room up, we'll get ready for threat, because the ability for our bodies to cool and resist our environment looks like stress. If I give us both a heavy boulder, our bodies will look ready for threat, because we're dynamically holding on to that weight, and that physiology is required. If I make this, sort of next to a Heathrow landing strip and a plane comes in, our bodies get ready for threat as that noise overwhelms our physiology. The only other times my body gets ready for threat is when I believe there's a threat. So those are the only 3 true stresses. Everything else is what we perceive. So if we both receive a piece of news and you go, oh my God, that means, let's imagine trains are cancelled back to Glasgow. It's a piece of news, right? But for you, that means a certain cycle of things. That means you can't get to this, you can't do that. And your physiology becomes alert and active as it anticipates all those threats that aren't actually happening. They may happen. That news doesn't affect me, but my physiology stays as it is. And what we've got is everyone's physiology is getting ready for what they think is about to happen next. And the more you see things that may happen next, that you may need to deal with, that you may need to be alert for, the more time you'll spend ready for threat. And the real cost of that is you spend less time recouping energy. And that, the nub of the energy equation is trying to get people to start framing energy as a valuable output of their lifestyle behaviors. So for me, the only true relevant goal is to get more energy, and that turns into performance, it turns into immunity, it turns into body composition and aesthetics. But reconciling that the more time we spend in our lives anticipating threats that are not real, the more wasted energy we accrue, unfortunately.
Wasted energy. That was the exact term that sprung to my mind there, because if you're preparing yourself for a fight that doesn't come, your body has still expended the energy to get ready for that fight.
100%. And even worse, it doesn't recalibrate after the fight. So the beauty of a fight is you have a fight, and then you get the endorphins, and then you get the sort of the wave of euphoria and recovery that comes afterwards. But what if you're always ready for a fight that never comes? And most people know, if they play high level sport, they feel good as soon as you kick off, right? Because suddenly you're moving, you're mobilizing some of those hormones that are intertwined with that nervous system, higher levels of adrenaline, higher circulating blood glucose, higher levels of cortisol. Your physiology is basically recalibrating through the act of fighting, of running, of playing football, of doing the thing. If you're just anticipating, you never get that recalibration, you never get that moment. And so it's far worse that you don't fight than if you did.
Yeah, it'd be better to use that energy that you've created than it to just be left stored, unused, and unnecessary.
100%. Why lots of people turn to physical activity. Physical activity is our recovery from stress.
An outlet.
It's an outlet. And it was the primitive man used to fight and flight stress. Modern man stews and chews on it. We sit in those emotions. It drives an increase in appetite. It will drive an increased propensity for carbohydrate rich foods, because my body with low energy wants more energy. It feels this threat's coming. It feels the walls of the medieval castle are soon to be under siege. So I'll carb up, get ready. And nothing happens. And we end up in this really odd cycle of perpetually ready for threat, disabling, physiological recovery, which extends into both sleep duration, but more importantly, sleep depth and quality. And then the next day, we're driven to behaviors like hypercaffeinating, like more refined carbohydrate, like being an argumentative, moody bastard, because they
having
all...
poor emotional regulation, you said. So for example, when my train cancellation comes, I'm less able to deal with it because I've been in fight or flight all day.
100%. 100%. And therefore, here we have that link between our behavior drives our physiology and our physiology drives our behavior. So lots of people are moody or snappy, not because they have a personality disorder, but because that's a reaction to low physiological energy. That's again, being kind to yourself.
Giving yourself the space to change your perception of many things that happen to you on a daily basis.
Massively. And activities that do that could be psychological. So we saw the rise of mindfulness. Mindfulness is a really interesting technique.
Well, I think I've heard you say before, we had 2 unicorn companies in Calm and
Headspace.
And Headspace.
Both
blew up.
Blew up and blew up because they talked about the right thing at the right time. And lots of corporates who were suffering with burnout and poor mental health across their employees felt that this would be a sort of hand-in-glove solution. I don't think it is. What they've realized is you can't have a brutal corporate culture and a very poor management style and offset that with people listening to 5 minutes.
It's a sticking plaster on a gaping wound.
Massively. And so I'm a big believer in visualization, in meditation as a whole, and mindfulness is more of a philosophy than a technique. It's being able to be in the present moment with a curiosity and openness. And what that means is when I'm in this moment, if I'm just in this moment now, my physiology should match this environment. But being in a sort of a perpetual catastrophized version of the future means my physiology lives there. And mindfulness is that break clause to go, what's actually happening at this moment? And when someone is shouting at me in my professional world, can I just pause and try and connect with curiosity as why they feel like that? So it's a really interesting technique that isn't about breath work, isn't about meditation, is about being in the moment with openness and curiosity. And I think that's a really strong modern technique that we'll see more of the coming years.
I struggled for a long time with trying to be more mindful through just mindfulness itself.
Yes.
And I think a lot of quote unquote fitness bros fall into that camp where we're able to build our body really well.
Yeah.
And then we're like, okay, well, what comes next? Like fitness is often the pebble at the top of the self-development avalanche.
Yes.
Because what I put in my body, how well I recover, how well I train, it's got me to this place. How do I work on what's going on between these top few inches?
So true.
And a lot of the time I found that mindfulness for me came from what we spoke about at the start, walks in nature.
Yeah.
Journaling.
Yeah.
Switching off. Things that actually involved me doing something.
Yeah.
Rather than I found meditation very, very difficult to do because I'm somebody that feels like I want to be doing something. Yeah. And maybe I'll work on that at some point in the future. But what I have found is pen to paper, away from devices, walk in nature, often without headphones. Again, I hate to have to caveat this, but if you're in an area that's not safe, of course have your phone with you, etc., etc. But
good,
if you can walk somewhere by yourself, or if you want to with a friend, unplug, you can find that can be quite regenerative as well. Even I'm speaking to his fiance later on today, Georgia, but I interviewed TJ Power, who's a neuroscientist, and TJ was speaking about even like singing in the shower can be regenerative from like an endorphins perspective, and that can be almost not a meditative experience but a recharging experience that makes you feel great. So I was singing in the shower this morning, I was like, I'm ready to go, and my friend's house in Clapham, he was like, don't wake the baby.
No, and it's good, and interestingly, and I like TJ Power enormously and the dose approach. I think there's a real
I'd love to hear him on the energy equation as well. I think that would be an incredible pod.
Could be good. Sow the seed.
Let's make it happen.
Let's make that really good. It'd be a great guest. And I think that understanding of our modern environment influencing, particularly the dopamine pathway is something that if people haven't read or listened, I know he's been on your podcast twice, I think, then he's someone you should listen to. But that principle, singing, gargling, humming are all actually activities that directly innovate the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. They also are mindful in the sense when you're doing them, you're probably not thinking about doing something else. So when you get these sort of combined modalities that bring the brain to the moment it's in, whilst deliberately targeting the body's ability to move into physiological calm, you get these double whammy impacts. And people then go online and say, oh my God, singing is the single point solution to stress. Nothing is the single point solution to stress, because stress, A, doesn't need a solution, but B, it's using these tools, as you spoke about earlier, dynamically the right tool at the right time. When you've got a busy day, singing, humming, gargling. I mean, gargling is a really odd one. I'm not suggesting you do that in public, but principally, these things all have a great scientific backing that we sort of have lost track of as we've sort of moved into.
We thought we got too clever. Yeah, we thought, in the modern world, we don't need these things.
Yeah.
But again, people take this to the extreme. Like, let's be a bit more primal.
Yeah. And primal, we've also, when people go, we've got to do the Paleolithic diet, we've got to leave our primal lives. I'm like, you died at like 31 in those eras. So let's not completely take that as a benchmark of
baby out with the bathwater.
But certain principles, what we have to reconcile is we've seen no meaningful evolution of human physiology for thousands of years. So the world that we woke up into today is markedly challenging across all the things that affect my physiology. Your point about mindset sort of being later down the line of personal strategies. When I think about well-being, we generally put 5 lenses on: my caliber and quality of movement, my caliber and quality of nutrition, my caliber and quality of recovery techniques, including sleep and stress management, my caliber and quality of physical environment. I know you've spoken about water filtration in the past and air quality, but also light, noise, social environment, cultural environment. And then finally, my psychological well-being, my ability to dictate my mood state through conscious actions and behaviors. And what you've got is all 5 of those affect your physiology. And if you've only chosen to learn about 2 of them, that your body doesn't really care about that. So if you're a gym bro and you love your macros and you love your training, but you've neglected sleep, you live in a toxic physical and social environment, and you don't like yourself, you won't be well. And what I'm always trying to do is elongate people's lens of well-being, not just to the thing they've naturally found easiest. And it's almost like the gateway drug is exercise, but when you're in, you've got to find the others. Otherwise, you won't achieve that well-being for longevity.
I think so many of the listeners are going to relate to that. And don't major in just one area.
Yeah.
And again, you don't want to be a jack of all trades, master of none, but let's try and have strong levels across all of these 5 areas, not just absolutely nail the fact that you got a 6-pack for your holiday this summer, but you neglected all these other things. You work in a job you hate, you hardly sleep, you're in a relationship that you fight like cat and mouse.
Yes.
It's not good.
It's not good. And again, there'll be some elasticity in youth about that you can see people who get pretty ripped without great diet, without great sleep. And it's sort of every year you get older, you need to increase your awareness and capability across those additional domains. You will not get, and you see this in professional sport. You'll see Ryan Giggs, the sort of original longevity footballer, took up yoga and Pilates towards the end of his career because he needed that restoration.
And he was living a pretty extracurricular life.
He had it,
that
would
have been stressful.
We should have put the moral caliber as the 6th pillar. And again, he extended his career. Ronaldo, we see using cold. He's in his infrared sauna on a near daily basis. If not
a really
daily.
bespoke supplement team through Bionics, I think it is, that he does that with, which is like very dialed in.
He's very dialed in. And again, when we look at nutrition, it's very difficult to be nourished without supplements. It's something we talk about an awful lot. From a sports performance point of view, it's unequivocally beneficial. From a supplementation point of view. But when we look at nourishment and the key purpose of food, most people are malnourished because they're eating either a very narrow or highly ultra-processed diet. So, all of these approaches that you see in these athletes trying to extend their career apply in sort of increasing dosages to the everyday athlete who just wants to feel well.
Yeah, my branding for a little while was the office athlete because in my sales career, traveling around the UK, trying to make big sales numbers, training, looking after my mind and my body, and then kind of creating content on the side of that, I really had to consider what can I borrow from the likes of the top performers and implement into my life. And that's been a lot of the mission behind the pod when it's come to building people for brain body business, has been what can I borrow from these experts that fits into my lifestyle. And that's exactly how we started today's conversation, wasn't it? And I wonder, what have been some of the themes that you've seen across the high performers that you've been interviewing on your show?
I think I suppose the themes would always be that the outcome is never worth it, in terms of the process is the joy, the growth is the joy. The achievement is sort of, in most cases, a bit of a disappointment. When people get to the top of the mountain.
Gold medal syndrome.
Yeah, and that, in business, in athleticism, you think you'll feel a certain way when you get there. And so often people neglected the fact that the feeling they really enjoyed was the strive to get there. And so I think trying to get people to have this strange balance between I'm striving for these definitive goals, really clear targets, but I will enjoy every moment I can in the pursuit of those, and nor will I define my happiness or my well-being by the achievement of that target. When we look at the marathon, which we're recording just before it comes up, the benefit of the marathon is the training for the marathon. The completion of the marathon is because you did the training. It's not turning up and doing the marathon. It's earning the right to do the marathon. That's what fulfills the moment. So I think, on the broader success perspective, it's making sure that we are tuned in to the journey, making sure that we're looking up and not saying, I'll be happy when. It's saying I need to be happy now in as much as I can be, but I hope that I'll feel a certain achievement when I get there. I think, you can't sacrifice well-being for achievement. I think people who've really sustained longevity in their business lives have dialed in fairly quickly to the fact that they need certain habits and behaviors to prop that up. What I saw consistently through both those on the Energy Equation podcast, but more importantly, my life looking after ultra high net worth individuals, was they had baked in lifestyle as a non-negotiable. Their training was not, if I get out of work early, I'll get it done. There was a slot in their diary.
It's in the diary.
And then their food prep was, in many cases, chef curated, or it was pre-organized. Their supplements were, strategically designed against their nutrient deficiencies. They made sleep a hero and, built the space and time for it. They adjusted to the rhythms of, of global travel with circadian rhythm management and jet lag protocols. They basically said, I can't do this if my body lets me down. And I think they become a really interesting example that well-being is not the purpose. Their purpose was the purpose. Well-being makes sure that they're able to get to their purpose. And I think when I work in the world of wellness, and as I'm around lots of great experts and great gurus who've made well-being the hero, it isn't. It's a set of rules and behaviors that allow you to achieve what it is you want from your life. And I think well-being's almost become like wealth to lots of people, that people are trying to accrue well-being without realizing the purpose of it is to spend it. The purpose of accruing wealth, you would hope, is to spend it, not to have it. There's a lot of people dying with a lot of money they never spent. And there's a lot of people accruing well-being that they've forgotten they should be applying to something more meaningful, be that relationships, be that personal.
And that taps into that spiritual energy you spoke about.
Agreed.
So if we're storing it up in these other areas, let's spend it in that area where we feel like we're doing something purposeful.
Yeah, and look for that. Work out what that is. And that doesn't, again, have to be sort of holier than thou. That doesn't mean we're all going and start an orphanage. That purpose could be reinvesting back into myself in a different way. But I think if we make well-being the hero, or we make wealth the hero, we forget neither of those things will be the thing that we're chomping about when we're lying on our deathbed.
Absolutely. On a practical level then, what are some of the lifestyle interventions that you see high performers making that somebody listening to this could implement?
They would put, I suppose, sleep would sit at the heart of that. It's very difficult. We saw the sort of the tech billionaires challenging sleep in terms of 4 a.m. club and the 3 a.m. club, and we had some fairly senior business people chomping at the bit for 4 hours sleep. And I think there's been a real kickback against that. What we normally see with people who sleep poorly or disregard sleep is neurocognitive decline, because really sleep, in amongst all the extraordinary things it does, it definitely cleans the debris out of our brain. So there's a pretty direct line between, neurocognitive would be your Alzheimer's, your dementia, that pathway, which is probably the most grotesque of the diseases that we want to avoid, truth be told. So sleep will be understood and managed. That doesn't mean it has to be perfect, but they'll often leverage sleep technologies, and lots of my clients would use technologies like 8 Sleep, which would monitor sleep and then change temperature of the bed to make sure that in 6 hours sleep, I still maybe get 90.
You're improving the quality of it, aren't you?
You improve the volume of deep and REM sleep with a smaller volume of sleep. So we call it sleep compression.
It seems that REM occurs earlier in the sleep cycle as well. And
normally the other way.
Sorry. The deeper sleep occurs.
Spot on.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what's the most regenerative.
Exactly.
And that's what's the most impacted by perhaps having caffeine too late, alcohol near bedtime, or at all. And that's interesting because I knew sleep was important. I had a Stanford professor on one of my early episodes called Dr. Nora Simpson.
Yep.
And she was sharing that REM sleep actually is helping us emotionally regulate and tolerate stress the next day.
Yes.
It was impacting dietary choices the next day. You spoke about the craving for carbohydrates and ultra palatable foods.
Massive.
Way less. People notice it on a hangover, and a hangover a lot of the time it's because they're sleeping, their blood sugars
spot on,
out of alignment. And the ability to make healthier decisions or better, clearer decisions is served by sleep the night before.
Yes.
Incredible.
It is the it sets the tone for your nutritional choices, your emotional choices. It sets the tone for your physical activity levels. When you are tired, if we go out and get hammered and don't sleep well, it's very difficult to lead a really nourishing life the following day. So I think understanding both sleep itself, sleep compression and optimizing that, and they'll be, they will all have definitive sleep hygiene protocols, which would be everything from the room is pitch black and I'm cooling myself before I go in, to a hard stop on caffeine, and management of alcohol normally into social situations only, but lots of them no alcohol at all. And that's a quantum shift from where we were probably before heart rate variability revealed to people how catastrophic small doses of alcohol are.
It was called a nightcap.
Yeah.
And it's putting you out not to sleep.
Spot on. So it's sleep fragments, so it kills the architecture of our sleep, which is the challenge. And you're right. So anything that keeps me primed from the day will cannibalize that sort of early deep sleep. And then again, if I'm not working on breaks in the day, if I'm not accessing nature, etc., then I'll see that depreciation of REM sleep, and that's really my creative brain, my trauma therapy, and my emotional regulation. So I think they put sleep and then probably physical activity as their number two. They would be drawn to high intensity work, and we often have to change that approach, that if you are having the day you've got today, then you doing a super high intensity exercise session at the end of the day.
Today's a rest day for me. I'll get some steps, that'll be it.
And that's perfect. But what you've done that is associate psychophysiological load with physical load, which is I had a really, really busy day. So that means I don't have as much capacity to rag my body later on. If I have a relatively low psychological day, then I might have that capacity to. So your body doesn't know the difference between you podcasting and you training. If it demands from you, you're ready for demand all day. And I think lots of that high performance audience were taught that again, you're forged in the fire. We build grit through high intensity exercise. And again, what gets you there in your early 20s won't carry you through to your mid 30s and 40s. And I think they learned to be more compassionate with their exercise, more, Pilates, yoga, breath work, mind body connection exercise, and moving cardio from sort of high intensity intervals to zone 2 or below work. They prioritize nutrition, but they often want nutrition condensed. So they all want the sort of personalized supplementation regime.
That's been the big thing for me, and making sure I nail the basics and have those foundations in place. But maybe listening to your episode with Ben Earl, for example, who many people will know is the England number 8, he spoke so well about some of the physical interventions he had as well as the supplemental stuff.
Yes.
So the blue light blocking glasses to support him with down regulating with his technology. But something that I found to be pretty massive for me, and also for my brother, and he's been tracking it with his Whoop, and we got to know each other through Pure Sport, magnesium. Yeah. Seriously underrated. And I think the data, we were speaking about data, critical analysis and studies, it's going to start to catch up with where we're seeing anecdotally very, very soon.
Vital. And I think, there's very few people who start magnesium and don't rave about it. It's one where there's a lot of those biased voices, but when there's a lot of them, there's good reason for it. I think what's interesting about magnesium is we are getting less in our diet, so that's sort of fairly unequivocal. Magnesium, a mineral that we draw from the earth. If there's less magnesium in our soil, there'll be less in our grains. There's less grains in our diet in the first place that haven't been, again, processed. And it's such a critical nutrient for almost every sort of neurological process in the body that we just haven't adapted to the fact there's less in our diet. And the role of magnesium biglycinate and glycinate in helping improve both muscle tension, but also improve the circulation of a neurotransmitter, GABA, makes it a potent sleep cocktail, but more importantly, a well-being cocktail. I used to run every sort of nutrient test we could. It's very difficult to work out who's nourished, right? So if someone says, do I eat a good diet? The traditional test would be lift up your t-shirt, let's have a look at the abs. And that's a reflection of calorie management and energy management. It's not a reflection of your macronutrient balance. To an extent, it will be in later life about your protein intake, but in early life, it's not.
Muscle retention, for example. Yeah.
Muscle retention, but it's got I have no idea whether you've got the key nutrients that fundamentally do biological jobs in your body. And the funny thing about human physiology is it doesn't work without nutrients. If I don't get vitamin C, I get scurvy. If I don't get vitamin D, my bones don't form, my immune system doesn't work. If I don't,
we don't get a lot of that in the UK, do we?
We don't.
And that's been something I've been on for best part of a decade. Right. Vitamin D3, yeah.
And there's no argument to almost not take vitamin D3. So, in the clinical testing, how would I work out if someone's nourished? So I could do a food diary, but you know, how much of that do they absorb? How much was in there in the first place? If you say you eat a piece of broccoli, was it, you know, organic, locally grown, seasoned, or was it, you know, something that's been, you know,
Had it been
flash
frozen
farmed?
and freezing packed? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and actually, you know, and those things again, freezing may be a benefit depending on where we sit out. But you know, if depending on how quickly the crop turnover has been, would be a big determinant of its nutrient density. But you know, I could look at diet, I could look at bloods, I can look at organic acids in your urine. It's difficult. We used to run all of those things, and I never met anyone in those years of clinical practice who didn't take vitamin D and had optimum vitamin D. So the argument to taking vitamin D3 is unequivocal. If you compare it with the K2, that's very logical to get more absorption in the bones. Magnesium, again, almost nobody we've ever, it's hard to measure. You can do white cell magnesium, red cell magnesium.
What I found when I've been researching this and from sources like yourself was how quickly the body needs to replenish it, because it burns through it so quickly. So I'm very regimented in my supplemental routine. I have stuff that I have first thing in the morning with my water and my electrolytes, and then I have what I have before bed. Albeit I try and cut water before bed.
Very good.
3-2-1's my rule. So 3 hours eat before, 2 hours stop drinking before, 1 hour stop devices if I can. That's the one that flexes sometimes, but I'm gonna get blue light blocking glasses, so it might all be fine.
Well, that'll get us into a whole separate debate. That's a really good protocol.
But the magnesium pre-bed,
yes,
as long as I'm doing it all the time and I'm building up, and I've got my little pill box that I bring with me when I'm down in London and when I travel with other engagements in other cities, and if I stick to that and I'm consistently having it, honestly, it's because I've given myself the chance to replenish it over and over and over again. There's not gaps.
I agree. And what it does, it takes the pressure off optimizing diet. You know, I can't look at my diet and go, did I get, you know, a totally optimized amount of omega-3 today, yesterday? Did I get the perfect amount of D? Did I get the right volume of magnesium? Did I get the right volume of X, Y, and X? So I want to eat food that gives me pleasure. Of course, I want it to be nutrient dense and rich, but I definitely don't want the inability to move, again, messaging through my body through magnesium deficiency. I don't want bone turnover or my immune system to suffer from a lack of, you know, the hormone effectively that is vitamin D3. I don't want my body to face a daily challenge without these nutrients available. So for me, supplementation it's a catch. It means I guarantee the cells of my body won't be deficient in the key things that they need. And I generally have worked backwards from, I've looked at my diet, I know who I am now, I'm, you know, mid to late 40s. I'm in that position where I know what I like what I know. My deficiencies will probably be my deficiencies thereafter. So I'll supplement my deficiencies. That's very logical for me.
It's the environmental challenges that I thought about. So for example, if there's less magnesium in the foods that we eat than ever before because of soil degradation and the processing of our foods, that's going to be a challenge. If that is impacting me on an environmental level, then I need to do something about it. After turning 30, I'm 32 now, I started using Tonka Ali, which again is something that Pure Sport thankfully do, because I was previously shipping it in from the US.
Oh, interesting.
And it was costing a fortune. And if we've got tariffs coming, then who knows how much worse it will get. 20% or 10% if Keir can do some negotiations, who knows. We'll see what the Donald says. But that for me was, environmentally, our testosterone's under attack through plastics, pollution, the quality of the food system. I have to do a lot to maintain my natural testosterone levels, and I train really hard and I try and look good, and it's all about drive as well. So Tonka Ali was a kind of intervention I took in January 2024.
Very good.
And it's been a game changer for me. But
Seen
again,
improvement? Have you measured pre and post?
Sex drive.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it would be one of the things, and my ability to hold on. Like I always walk around really lean, been in good shape for a long time, but that started to get a little bit more challenging. And I thought, that's interesting. And then so my training performance improved, strength went up. I don't really do 1 rep maxes, I'm not interested in that, but kind of like 10 to 12 to 15 rep maxes. I was like, oh, I'm starting to maintain weights that I used to touch before, and I'm still walking around with the level of leanness that I've got, and my energy level was great, my drive, jumping out of bed in the morning wood is a very good sign.
Morning wood is a good sign.
And that for me has been one of the main interventions that I've made, that I thought, environmentally, I'm borderline under attack. I need to do something about this.
Agree. It's a huge area in terms of, you know, there's lots of question marks. There's been some recent studies on why so many people below 30 are developing cancer, and we can look at this again, a very immune challenging physical environment.
An estrogenic environment.
Estrogenic environment. So, you know, we are seeing the deterioration of natural levels of testosterone much earlier. That estrogenic environment has all those environmental factors, from potential hormones in water to the microplastics to other.
We spoke about filtering my tap, didn't we?
Yeah, you know, there's a great logic to that. The biggest seeming challenge is poor body composition. So lots of men, you know, with the role of body fat, and body fatness, particularly in the visceral area, challenges my ability to manufacture, testosterone, certainly by making my testosterone to estrogen ratio a little bit off kilter. We also know that testosterone is built from the same building block as cortisol. So we have a sort of master shell called pregnenolone, which is this element that turns into testosterone, turns into cortisol. And if I make a lot more cortisol because I'm in that perpetual state of readiness, then I depreciate my body's natural ability to manufacture testosterone. And so we've got this sort of highly, poorly recovered, slightly low lean tissue, high body fat, estrogenic environment. Of course, people's T levels are off where they should be. We had Sir Steve Redgrave on the podcast, who was misdiagnosed with a sort of clinical depression for 13 years. Certainly he would cite that he did have the key symptoms of depression, but that seems to correlate with a misdiagnosis of him going through the andropause, which is our male version of the menopause, and having T levels that bottomed out. And his application of exogenous testosterone, so he's on testosterone
TRT,
replacement therapy, TRT, has been transformative for him in both mood, energy, other. And Tonkat Ali is a really interesting element. I take Tonkat Ali because my T levels are okay, but I don't want to go on to testosterone replacement therapy. I want to promote my natural production.
That's a huge commitment from an admin perspective.
And when you're on it, it's only going to go one way. The thing with all hormones is they work on an intelligent feedback loop, that the body doesn't want too much of anything. Doesn't want to put too much testosterone in. Of course, we see that shrinkage of the gonads, and people get tiny knackers,
acne,
and more importantly, they're reducing their ability to manufacture thereon. Same with everything. So more is not better with physiology. In fact, there's only one physiological parameter which has no upper limit of benefit, and that's something called VO2 max. So VO2 max, the measurement of cardiorespiratory fitness, which we also take on our energy equation guests, is the only physiological parameter that the higher the better, regardless of number. Everything else goes negative after it goes too high. And hormones, absolutely. So to try and promote more T through managing body fat, managing an estrogenic environment, through a prioritization of resistance training, and again, potentially using intelligent elements like Tonkat Ali, for me sits as a very logical well-being strategy.
I think so much of what we've covered today, and Ollie, I would love around too in the near future, and I'm sure the listeners will be screaming for that as well, is empowering people to make a choice about what they put in their body, what they put in their mind, how they manage their schedule. And it's giving them the best opportunity to live this high energy, positive lifestyle that so many of us crave.
I hope that's the theme of everything, is that autonomy that says, look, what we've understood as we've decoded the genome and we've understood DNA, your health, your longevity, your performance is not held within your genetic material. It's held through your lifestyle, and your lifestyle are the aggregated sum of the actions you take, and those actions are conscious and unconscious, and your body doesn't care whether they're conscious or unconscious. It just knows what it gets and what it doesn't get. And what we're really talking about here is understanding a broader number of levers that you can pull, and there may be some things that you didn't realize were a lever at all. Strategies around psychological well-being, strategies around recovery, strategies around your physical environment. But the more we get people to understand that those levers are there to be pulled, but not all of them to be pulled all the time, the better we have a chance of resisting a really difficult environment in which to be well. And that is the change, right? The world you and I have woken up into today is arguably the hardest time in human history in which to be well, not to be not ill. That was before antibiotics and our ability to understand bacterial infection. But this is the most challenging time in human history where we've got all these new things, but we don't know how to use them or mitigate them or manage them. So what we're looking at is just understand the rules of the game a little bit more, and then apply a layer of compassion to trying to put the right tool in at the right time. And energy is a fantastic overall barometer of that.
Ollie, thank you so much for that. I'm sure the listeners have loved it. If they want to continue the conversation with you, where should they head towards?
Well, good question. So probably best is the Energy Equation podcast, which is on all good, again, streaming and podcast platforms. I've got a website, oliverpatrick.com, if people want to see what I'm up to more generally. But the Energy Equation is probably the best place to glean the key information.
Yeah, and I certainly recommend it. Those will both be linked in the show. So thank you to Ollie, and thank you to the listener. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.